with a lot of students wondering, what does test optional mean for me? How do I approach this? Do I submit a test score? Do I not? And so we're going to talk about this today, right? Did test optional level the playing field, or did it just create more confusion, more applications, and more stress? Hello, and welcome to the Admittedly podcast. My name is Thomas Caleel. I'm the former director of MBA admissions and financial aid for my alma mater, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. In this podcast, I don't promise easy answers or quick fixes, but I will use my decades of experience to help you achieve your education goals. Now let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Admittedly podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Caleel, and today we're going to talk about test optional. Are test optional policies here to stay? Did they really level the playing field? This is something I hear a lot about from our followers on social media, at Admittedly Co. on Instagram and TikTok. And I love this conversation. I love this dialogue. As we're closing in on a new admissions season, with a lot of students wondering, what does test optional mean for me? How do I approach this? Do I submit a test score? Do I not? And so we're going to talk about this today, right? Did test optional level the playing field, or did it just create more confusion, more applications, and more stress? So we're going to separate the PR and all the insanity that goes on around this on social media, and we're going to talk about the reality of test optional. So let's talk about this a little bit. Let's start with the origin of test optional. Now, when I was at Wharton, I spoke with a lot of people who were very, very adamant that testing was discriminatory, that it absolutely discriminated against lower income students, right? Why is that? Number one, they don't have access to the testing materials that most people do. And, back then there wasn't Khan Academy. The playing field wasn't nearly as level. I know today there are a lot of free applications and things that you can get, but the reality is that, middle to high income students, they have tutors. They are spending sometimes tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on test prep, on coaches, on guides. So it does create a very, a very unlevel playing field, to say the least. There's also an argument that lower income students don't grow up in an environment where they are encouraged to read as much. The vocabulary is very different in the house. And so they start at a natural disadvantage, no matter how bright they are, heading into standardized testing. There's a lot of data on this. There's a lot of studies that show this to be the case. But what actually started this whole movement? And what happened basically was that COVID-19 hit. And when COVID-19 hit, a lot of students were actually unable to take a standardized test. And the testing companies tried to react to this, but they didn't do it quite quickly enough. And a lot of, at first, the liberal arts schools said, hey, this might be a really good way for us to expand our applicant pool. What do I mean by that? Well, having test score ranges, SAT, ACT, and during this podcast, when I talk about one test, I'm really using them both interchangeably, right? So testing, I refer to SAT and ACT because the universities don't really care which one you take. But the universities said, hey, listen, there are obviously inherent socioeconomic biases built into the testing that I've discussed in terms of access to tutoring, just exposure to vocabulary and other modalities around the test. And so they said, maybe what we can do is do away with testing and just rely on grades, because academics, if you look at it, it's 4 years of consistent effort. And is that a better indicator of academic ability than, say, 1 2 to 4 hour test that you have to cram for? And there's a lot of variables that go into that. And so one of the reasons they did this too is they wanted to expand diversity in the pool of applicants. And this is really, really important, right? Because when you're looking at this from the position of admissions, they want as many students at the beginning of the funnel, at the top of the funnel, as they can get, right? The more interesting, the more diverse students they get in, the more choices they have down the line. Now, one of the things that people don't think about is that SAT, ACT ranges, averages, things like that can be very discouraging to wonderful students that you would otherwise want to apply. So if you are, let's say you're a gifted engineer, you get an 800 on the SAT math, but you only manage a 690 on the verbal part, right? that puts you outside the range for a lot of top schools. Now, there's an argument that says, well, there's better engineers who can do well on both sections, but there are also extremely gifted mathematicians who don't do well on the verbal part. Just like you might have a really gifted writer or poet or artist or chemist who just can't make the quantitative section work. And what happens a lot of times is that those students then self-select out of the applicant pool. So here's a controversial statement. Schools work very hard to keep their average SAT and ACT scores and test band lower. You're like, wait, Thomas, why is that? Why would they do that? Wouldn't Stanford, wouldn't Harvard, wouldn't Yale, wouldn't they want the highest possible average SAT to be like, hey, we've got the smartest students ever? Well, here's the thing. The answer is no, they don't, because what that does is you scare off really talented, really interesting applicants. You might scare off those first-gen low-income students who don't have access to the materials and test prep and resources that wealthier students have. And so by kind of pushing that down, you open it up to a much broader range. Now, the reality is the band, that middle 50% band at the top schools is usually like 1520 to 1570. So there's only so far you can push it down. But here's an interesting statistic. So when I was running MBA admissions at Wharton, we used the GMAT. The GMAT is a standardized test and graduate management admissions test, and it's scored out of 800. And so you get a score, anywhere from 600 to 800, 800 being perfect. And so every year we'd get around 8,000, 8,500 applications. And of those, right, over 3,000 applications would have GMAT scores of 750 or higher. And that's like 90th percentile or higher. And so we could have I could have easily filled the class with perfect GMAT scores, 800s. Could have done that. But it really discounts and disallows a lot of really interesting other students in there. So we kept an eye on our average GMAT because we didn't want to discourage students from applying. And the same goes for universities, graduate programs. Everybody is trying to manage the optics and manage the number. So what this test optional did was it gave these universities a really good marketing tool. It allowed them to increase the number of applications. If you increase the number of applications and your number of seats, admission seats doesn't change, what do? You lower your admit rate. Lower admit rates can impact rankings and prestige. And so it was this great thing for them. The other thing that most people won't talk about is that by removing standardized test scores, you also create this great little backdoor, right? So if I have a donor child or I have an athlete and they just aren't there on the standardized testing, they can apply test optional. We can bring them into the class, right? And there's no impact on the stats. We don't have to show that like, oh, hey, who's this outlier with the 28 ACT or the 26 ACT? We don't need to report that now. Now, the result was that the average SAT and ACT scores crept up, right? Because who submits their test scores? Students who do really well. And so there is definitely a bias in the data. The data show an upward trend there. So as it's opened up, as some of these schools go to test required and do away with test optional, I think you will see a little bit of a retreat on the average SAT and the ACT banding in there. But I think it's really important to note that the schools don't have to do this. They're making a willing choice, a willing decision to let those numbers ease off because they do want to attract these broader, more diverse, more equitable applicant pools and matriculate a more diverse and equitable class, right? Because diversity does matter in a class. Diversity is absolutely important. Diversity on all metrics is critical. And if you're just judging people on a standardized test, you are missing a lot in there. Now, standardized testing has become important because grade inflation has really, really wreaked havoc. So admissions officers are looking at GPAs, at grades, and they're like, can we even trust this, right? So a selection bias happens where they're going back more often to schools where they know the rigor, they trust the rigor, they trust the grades that they're getting. But at the end of the day, this move back towards standardized testing is also being accelerated by changes in the administration. Schools are being defensive in posture, and they're saying, okay, if we are facing a lawsuit, if we have to show all the data from the class that we're admitting, we want to show that we can defend admitting students based on merit versus other factors. So bottom line here, students, testing is absolutely going to matter this year, next year, year after. It's mattering even more. So you're going to have to do what you need to do. Get tutors. There are paid tutors. There are free tutors. There's Khan Academy. I get a lot of students who kind of say, I don't have the time. I don't have this. I don't have that. Well, somewhere out there are a lot of students who are making the time, right? You're not going to catch this up in a month or two. You need to start early. You can start as early as sophomore year. Practice, practice, practice. This is time under tension. This is an exercise in discipline and pain management. If you devote yourself, dedicate to it, you can crack this. You need to learn the system of the test, not just the material of the test, and you'll see a big dividend, big payoff in your scores. So when we look at the data so far, right, what happens? So clearly wealthier students who could afford to do test prep, get higher scores, were submitting test scores under test optional, right? And there are many schools now who are still test optional. NYU, Columbia, the University of California system doesn't even accept test scores. So you're at no disadvantage if you apply to the University of California system. But really what happens here is you do see a skew on the scores towards a wealthier and more privileged demographic. So as the schools move away from test optional into test required, I think you're going to see a bit of a reconfiguration of the class composition. This also ties to the fact that schools are under financial assault, and they are going to be more biased towards full pay students. How that shakes out, we have to see. I've spent the last few months crisscrossing the country, talking to friends, former colleagues in admissions offices, in administration in the top universities, and there's a lot of uncertainty. They're not really sure what the applicant pool is going to look like. They're not really sure how they're going to have to react to different changes handed down from various entities and the administration. And so a lot of this is in the air, and we're going to really follow this closely and keep you up to speed here. Now, I get asked a lot on social media, well, does test optional really mean test optional? And my answer to that is, look, if you're in a demographic that can withstand a lack of test scores, if you're a first-gen low-income student, right, you can get away with not submitting a test score. If you if you are bringing something to the university that is truly unique, you might be able to get away with that. But otherwise, have the discipline. I know it's hard. I know that you're busy. I know you don't have a lot of time. I get that. But the reality is, and especially now for a lot of top schools that are test required, we need you to buckle down. We're going to need you to get that test score. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it does need to reinforce your academics. The good news for students who have, let's say, weaker academics or a wobble in their academics, you can absolutely help bolster your case. You can't undo academic damage, but you can help mitigate it by getting a really good test score. So if, let's say, you got a B+ in calculus, but then you come in with like a 780, 790 on the math section of the SAT, you're in a good position, right? You're showing, hey, listen, that was a hard class. It kind of rolled over me a little bit. I worked hard, but here's my, innate ability here. And that can definitely work to your advantage. But I think that simply, if you're going to a good private school and you've got decent grades and you're not submitting a test score, admissions officers are looking at that and like, probably did not do the job he needed to do on the test. If you have accommodations and the nature of the test just kind of flummoxes you, then you can certainly write about that in the additional information essay and just talk about like, hey, I tried this with time and a half. It wasn't working. I did tutoring. I did this. I did that. It's just not working for me. You might be able to mitigate that in a test optional school. But again, and this is very unpopular advice, but universities are admitting you to be a student. And when you get to university, you're going to be under a lot of pressure, time pressure, academic pressure, social pressure, and you're going to need to perform on testing. And you're going to need to perform on papers and finals and things like that. So they're trying to assess, can you juggle multiple responsibilities in an academic realm and perform well? And if you can't, you just might not be the right fit for that university. It's not saying you're a bad person, but they are evaluating you on that. So, as we move into this new cycle, keep in mind what schools are going test optional. I want you to think about, how does test optional fit into my personal strategy? As I'm positioning myself, how does this work? For international students, it's really not test optional. You need to step up and get this done. Maybe if you have significant financial hardship, you might argue that, but at the end of the day, I think it really puts you at a disadvantage. In terms of the colleges, they will tell you when they talk to you that testing, if it's test optional, you don't need to submit a test score, et cetera, et cetera. They really mean it. But at the end of the day, if you have it and you have a good one, you have to, and it can only help your application if you do the work. So keep that in mind. Gear up for my sophomores and juniors. You need to be focused on this. This is only an accelerating trend where schools are doing away with test optional. And I really need you to lean into this and do the work. I know I can't have you crossing your fingers and hoping that test optional is going to come back, because nothing that I'm seeing or hearing indicates that that's the case. If you look at like MIT, Dartmouth, Yale, they're bringing back testing. All of these schools will follow that. Some of the mid to lower tier schools may leave test optional or do away with testing because they're looking to juice their application numbers. Application numbers can help generate revenue, and it also helps push their admit rate down, makes them look more selective. All of these things kind of feed into each other. And also I think there is obviously a part of admissions where, again, they do want to provide access. They do want to open the doors and say, hey, we want the most possible students applying. We want to give the most opportunity to the most diverse amount of students, diverse array of students that we can. And so I think the intention there is good, but we have to look at the pragmatic realities. So what are the takeaways here? You have to treat this as not test optional, but test optional for select groups. And if you are a upper middle class kid coming out of, a good school district, you have to submit standardized testing. You need to do the work. You can't put it off. I know you're busy. You need to have the discipline, the drive, the focus. You need to use your resources selectively. If you're stuck somewhere, find a tutor, find an online tutor, a free tutor, a peer tutor, talk to a senior or somebody who's already been through this, ask them for help, do what you need to do to break through the barriers to get the score that you need to get, right? Build a strategy. Again, freshmen, sophomore, juniors, you're taking this test, and this test is going to have a big impact on where you can apply and what your final outcomes are. Hope is not a strategy. Discipline focus is a strategy. So my prediction, some schools will remain test optional, but I think the vast majority are going to go to test required. I think pressure from the administration, I think grade inflation, and I think that just a need to kind of tighten up the academic boundaries that the admissions officers are setting. It's just all contributing. It's a perfect storm here. So your takeaway here is you need to do the work, you need to prepare. But I'd like to know, what do you think? I love engaging with you on social media at AdmittedlyCo. That's at AdmittedlyCo, Instagram, TikTok. Jump on there. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me what's on your mind. Are you stressed about this? Do you agree with this? Do you think that it's fair for schools to try and push the average test score down? Do you think it's fair for schools to move away from test optional? I want to know what you think. I'm here. I'm going to keep a close eye on this for you, and we'll talk a lot more about this as the year goes on. Thank you for following. We'll see you soon. Thank you for joining us today. Please take a moment to subscribe to the Admittedly podcast and download this episode. I welcome you to share your thoughts and questions with me. You can find us on social media at Admittedly Podcast. I look forward to continuing our journey